that report, as Elisa said, is alarming. What do you think should be happening? What do you think should be changing?
Well, I think that there are two things. There is overfishing and there's climate change. And as Elisa said, the climate change report that was released last year was alarming for a lot of people. But what is also alarming for a lot of people is that the biggest impact on our ocean is actually fishing. So the other big report that was released last year was a report about biodiversity and our ecosystems. It was an international report as big and as important as the IPCC special report on the ocean and cryosphere. And it stated that we're threatening 1 million species with extinction, and we are destroying the very systems of nature that are keeping us alive. The ocean provides half of our oxygen that we breathe. It is the biggest store of carbon on the planet. But actually, even though we feel like climate change impacts are getting quicker, and they're getting very bad, and they are, actually still for the ocean, the biggest impact is fishing. And I think most people would be surprised that the EU committed to end overfishing by 2020 in 2013, and it's still overfishing now. And around 40% of our fish populations in the Northeast Atlantic are still being overfished. So I think that is surprising, but I think that also provides us an opportunity, because actually, compared to decreasing the amount of CO2 emissions that we have, ending overfishing is fairly direct and and quite achievable in a very short period of time. So I think that's a good kind of intersection.
This is it. I mean, the stats are that 40 to 70% of fish stocks in European waters are overfished. The quota system that the EU has in place is obviously not working, Elisa. How do you change that?
I would disagree with what you've just said. I think the quota system does work. If we look at the Northeast Atlantic, we've seen that over the last decade, we've seen the biomass, this is the biomass of the fish, increase by more than a third. More than 99% of all the fish that is landed in the Northeast Atlantic is fished sustainably. So we do see an increase in the number of quotas that are set at levels corresponding with, we call that maximum sustainable yield, so at sustainable levels. So more and more the TAC and quota system, which we have in the Northeast Atlantic, is showing its results. We have to say that we're only going back towards 2013, which is when we had the last reform of the common fisheries policy, and progress is slower than expected, but it's there. So with more than 99% of all landed fish in the Northeast Atlantic being fished at sustainable levels, I definitely say that progress is being made.
What do you need to do to increase the progress, though? What does the Commission do to
I
change
think
that?
we need to make sure that we continue to get good scientific advice, so working with the scientific community to make sure that we have the right stock assessments, that we get the right advice, because all our decisions are based on scientific advice. So if we get good scientific advice, it means that we can get we can take the right decisions. I think we need to work closer with member states to improve things like selectivity, so to make sure that the gear types they're using, the fishing techniques they're using, the methods that they're using are much more selective. We need to work also with member states and managing and authorities to ensure that the right control and enforcement rules are being applied, but also that across different member states, they're collecting the information that is needed through what we call it the data collection framework, to ensure that that the scientists have the raw data available to give us the right advice so that we can make the right decisions.
Before you, okay, I'm just going to pull this microphone a bit closer to you.
Thank you.
So, but moving on to that, Elisa's saying here that the scientific advice maybe isn't there, but that isn't what you believe, right?
Well, I think there's two things. I agree with Elisa that the quota system, it's not broken in the sense that the system isn't broken. I think the application and the implementation of the system is what's not actually happening, and that's our challenge. Progress to implement the fisheries policy and the quotas has been too slow, far too slow, considering that we are in a biodiversity crisis. It's not just a climate crisis, it's not just a climate emergency, it's a biodiversity emergency. And the 99% of fish stocks landed are sustainable is definitely an improvement, and there has been progress made. But my reference was that 47 or 40, over 40% of Northeast Atlantic stocks are still being overfished. And what is important here is not just which fish stocks are commercially profitable or important for the industry. That is an important factor, of course. But for an ecosystem to function, we need all species in the ecosystem to be healthy. And that is the commitment of the EU Common Fisheries Policy. It's the commitment, it's certainly what, citizens expect and support. They want, starfish, sea dragons, dolphins, sharks. They want the ugly fish they want the fish that they don't eat to also be healthy. And that is where we still have a problem. We have this system that is being run and implemented that is still benefiting a small proportion of people and ignoring the rest of the people.
Who's that small proportion of people?
So there are a few in the industry who benefit greatly from greater quotas in the short term. I mean, ultimately, actually, of course, they don't either, because actually a healthier ecosystem, sustainable fisheries, they actually are far more economically, productive for everybody. But of course, you can always have this, short-term profit driver, and that is what is driving still our decisions on fisheries management at the moment. And so we have still ecosystems that are not healthy. I mean, we have a commitment to end overfishing, which we haven't yet delivered on. And we also have a commitment to restore the health of our marine ecosystems. And the reason why I say that it's important to everyone is that we all need the ocean to be healthy. We all need the oxygen that it provides. We need it to continue to store carbon, and we need it to continue to absorb the heat. I mean, 90% of the excess heat that has been created from climate change is stored by the ocean. So if it weren't for the ocean, we would be melting down right now, like literally in some kind of complete Armageddon of climate crisis. So the ocean is absolutely fundamental to us all, and fishing is still the biggest impact on that. And so relative, the scope of that problem, the potential for the ocean to be a solution for us is enormous, but it's being undermined by this failure to really rebuild and deliver for all of our fish stocks, not just the ones that are most economically profitable.
Are you only interested in handsome fish, not ugly fish, Elisa? I wonder, how do you see the change in this? How do you respond to what they're saying there?
Well, I'm interested in all fish, and I think that the Common Fisheries Policy is also about ensuring that we take what's called an ecosystem-based approach. So we don't just focus on the fish that we're catching to eat or to use for other sources, but that we also look at the marine ecosystem as a whole. But it's important to remember that the marine environment and the impact on marine biodiversity, and I fully agree with what Rebecca was saying, is that it's not just, fishing is just one of the pressures. And over the last few months, we've been talking a lot about the Baltic Sea, for example. And in the Baltic Sea, last year, quite unexpectedly, or maybe not so unexpectedly, we had the collapse of Eastern Baltic cod. And this was quite surprising because over the last few years, it seemed as if the stock had been recovering, and it seemed that things were on the right track. But if you look at the nitty-gritty of what happened what's happening in the Baltic, it's not just fishing pressure which is affecting the state of the marine environment. We have, for example, land-based pollution, which is affecting the state of the Baltic Sea. Farms that are releasing nitrates into rivers or inland waterways that then end up into the Baltic Sea. We have other sources of land-based pollution. We even have so I read a study somewhere about unused or undetonated bombs and things lying on the seabed, which are obviously releasing chemicals or releasing toxic substances which are affecting the whole state of the marine environment. So we need to look at the marine environment as a whole. And obviously with fisheries, there's a lot we can do. But I think that in order for us to see a restoration of the marine environment as we would want to see it in Europe, we cannot just look at fisheries as the only source of pressure on the marine environment. So we need to be looking at things like the interaction between agriculture and the state of our seas. We need to be looking at maritime transport. We need to be looking at issues of where we're putting our offshore energy, so our windmills. So all of those factors play a role. And it's important that we look at all of those factors to find the solutions to those challenges to the marine environment and the restoration of the marine ecosystem.
I mean, you say that there needs to be more of an approach, but it is overfishing that is the biggest problem, right? So
I disagree. I don't think it is. I really don't think it is. And I gave the example of the Baltic as one of the examples. But we also have to understand that, let's take the North Sea, for example. The North Sea is one of the more transited seas. You have shipping lanes. You have offshore renewable energy parks, windmill parks, which are popping up here and there. So all of that, as well as climate change, is affecting the distribution of fish. We're seeing fish pushing up north. So fish which was traditionally being fished around the North Sea is now increasingly moving upwards due to the cold temperatures. We've seen cases of bluefin tuna, which is a fish normally found in warmer waters, being used for fish and chips. There were all these stories in the British press about them accidentally arriving into the fish and chip shops because we're finding fish stocks where we didn't used to find them before. And this is partly, and I go back to the first point I was making, rising temperatures and the pressures that are coming from elsewhere. So I don't agree that fishing is the only pressure. I think that we need to look at it as part of a wider, a bigger picture. I think there's a lot we can do. I think there's a lot that we are doing, but I agree we still need to make more progress, and this is why we're here.
So keep sending in questions on our Fish Radio hashtag on Twitter. We will pick them up, and if there's anyone in the room that wants to use that hashtag as well. So anyone on the live stream, we will get to your questions a little bit later. Beck, I'll move on to you to discuss what people at home can do. You know, people, the choices of fish that they're buying and the ways that they're purchasing things. What can a consumer of fish products do if they're concerned about climate change?
Well, I think this is always a really tricky question because actually everywhere you go, different fish are in different state of health. So the example that Elisa gave of the Eastern Baltic cod was interesting because actually, you know, in the Baltic, you wouldn't choose to eat cod. Most people wouldn't choose to eat cod right now if they wanted to purchase sustainable fish because the Eastern Baltic cod and Western Baltic cod are drastically overfished. They're in very unhealthy states as well as having been overfished for many years. And you wouldn't touch them. It's very unfortunate. And whereas in the North Sea, you know, the North Sea cod had been improving. It was also overfished for a long time. It got healthier. It got certified with Marine Stewardship Council certification, which people will often look for. It's like a third-party stamp.
Do you trust that, right? That's the stamp.
Well,
right?
I mean, personally, what I would do is I would try to buy directly from a fisher, personally, and I would choose to buy fish from people who don't use highly impacting gears like bottom trawls.
But when you're going to your supermarket,
yeah,
that is not a way of finding that
It's
out.
really not. And this is the problem, actually, to be clear. This is the problem that we have. And this is why we need the Common Fisheries Policy implemented. And this is why we need our fishing rules enforced. Because if we had a Common Fisheries Policy that was implemented, we would know that when we bought fish that was caught in Europe, it was caught from a sustainable fishery. that would be the easiest solution. This is where we really want to be, and this is what we should be offering for our citizens. We shouldn't have to say to people, okay, you need to ask your fisherman, what gear does he use? You need to ask, is this fish, sustainable? Is it also seasonal? Because essentially there are so many questions that it makes it very difficult for the average person to contribute.
Yeah, people don't know what the
Exactly.
difference between North Sea or Eastern Baltic cod might be.
Exactly. So a third-party certification is the easy way to choose a more sustainable fish, a more sustainable seafood.
How do we implement that then?
I agree with Rebecca. I think there are a number of tools that citizens have at their disposal where they can choose the most sustainable. One is if you live in a coastal area, the best is to buy directly from the fishermen. That's possible. It's not always the case. If you live in Brussels, it's not like you can go and drive to Ostend to get your fish. But they have, for example, I saw a fantastic project in France of a subscription delivery service. So that you can get fresh fish twice a week, and it's a local initiative, and they're responsible for sourcing the fish from sustainably sourced fish with sustainable gears, seasonal as well, because that's also very important. So I think there's a lot of initiatives going on, private or semi-private, publicly financed, for citizens to use. There's apps that you can use where you can look at what fish should I be buying in this particular season.
But all this is putting the sort of onus on the consumer to have to do the research, rather than a structure being in place where we all just know what's going on. The red tractor, for instance, is a thing with farming products, right?
I think it goes both ways. I think consumers have, and it's not that they should have a responsibility. I think they want to have the responsibility to know what it is that they're buying, and they want
But
to
having
have
a
the
special
assurance.
app that they've had to download themselves, it's them having to do that rather than...
But I think we see the same thing also with other food products. When you go to the supermarket and you have choices. You can buy in an organic market. You can buy organically, locally sourced products. You are making that choice. You, as a consumer, are making the choice to buy one product over another. Having said that, and this is something that the Commission is working very closely in one of the next initiatives will be the farm to fork initiatives. So really looking at sustainable food systems from farm to fork, or in our case, from net to fork. But then we also have the responsibility, not just for consumers, to make sure that they're getting the right products and that they're making the right choices, but we as fisheries managers, and here I speak for myself working for the European Commission, but also member states when they take decisions on quotas, or member states when they implement the rules that we have of the common fisheries policy and the fishing sector, we have a collective responsibility to make sure that the objectives that we have set out in 2013 and before, to ensure that all stocks are being fished at sustainable levels, that this indeed happens. We've had progress. We've had lots of progress. As I mentioned, 99% of landings in the Northeast Atlantic are now being fished at sustainable levels. We have the first ever multi-annual management plan in the Western Mediterranean to ensure that fishing effort is reduced so that we can start to rebuild up stocks there, also to levels that are sustainable. And we have more and more agreements with the third countries in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea for things like fisheries restricted areas, so closures where specific areas where the marine ecosystem or the is particularly fragile, that we don't fish there, or that we use less damaging techniques. You're
here painting a relatively positive picture, and I suppose it's possible to do that because you're trying to put in things. But there are, I mean, you certainly don't see things quite as positively as that. Now let's move on to the fishermen, the fishing industry. If what you're suggesting of really nailing back the overfishing in the seas, wouldn't this be very, very detrimental to Europe's fishing industries?
Well, all the evidence says no. In fact, strangely enough, which is why it doesn't make sense that we're still overfishing, But in experience of following scientific advice with setting fishing limits, in fact, actually what happens, the purpose of doing this, so the purpose of ending overfishing is not to stop fishing or to limit fishing, it's to restore the fish populations. It's to restore healthy ecosystems. Because when an ecosystem is healthy, just like your body, it works better. So if you're healthy and you're fit, you know, you feel really good, you can go out partying, you can work, but you can also just, you know, do a lot of things. You can function. If you have overdone it or you're sick, then you can't function properly. And it's the same with the ocean ecosystem. It's the same with fish populations. So the purpose of ending overfishing is to rebuild those fish stocks. We are only, I mean, we suffer from this thing called the shifting baseline with oceans and fish, where people who, what they see now is their kind of, is their relative point or their point of understanding. Whereas if you were looking at fish stocks or fishing 20 or 30 years ago or 50 years ago, you have a completely different picture. And so, you know, yes, we've made progress since 2013 or even 2005. We may have 30% more biomass in the ocean, but compared to 50 years ago or 100 years ago, what is that? Is that actually... Is it then only 5% more compared to those? We've had a very big impact on the ocean over decades. So, and what restoring those fish populations can do is like with a bank account. So the more you get in it, you can take the cream off the top. And so obviously, if the bigger your bank account, the more cream you get, the more interest you get off the top. And it's exactly the same with fisheries. So it's been estimated that if we implemented the CFP and stopped overfishing, I have the exact figures from the New Economics Foundation, who also does quite a lot of work, I think, commissioning for the Commission and other governments, EU member state governments, that we could make an extra 1.6 billion euros in revenue a year.
From fisheries in Europe.
From sustainable fisheries.
Yeah.
And it would create an extra 20,000 new jobs. And that's not even when you consider the food security results of that, which is like, okay, 89 million people can eat fish, more fish. There are enormous benefits, and that's just the economic value directly for that one industry. That is not the incredible economic value of having healthy ocean ecosystems, as we discussed, their incredibly important role to climate mitigation and adaptation. So I think the benefits are massive and clear, and the question is, why are we still not doing it? Why haven't we done it when we had a deadline? Let's forget, okay, it's 2020, we should have done these things by now, but looking forward...
Who do you blame for it not being done?
Look, I think you can't blame any one individual, and this is the challenge, is that with the EU we had 28, now 27 governments, and we also have the Commission, and you have the Parliament is less really related now because each year annual fishing limits are set by the Council, but the Commission also proposes them. And for 2020, for this year, actually the Commission proposed many fishing limits above scientific advice for sustainable levels. Now, I understand that it was a very difficult year in terms of big proposed cuts from scientists because actually the signs are not great for a number of fish stocks. But by continuing to go above that advice, we're not actually, repairing the problem. We're not rebuilding those fish stocks.
Why did that happen? Why were the limits above the scientific advice, Elisa?
The Commission's proposal is always in line with the scientific advice, and in particular, we need to understand that in some situations we have a mixed fishery. So fishermen don't always catch one particular fish stock; they catch 1, 2, 3, 4 different stocks. So it's very difficult to ensure that you always have the perfect catch limits in a mixed fisheries context. I think that's quite important. I think the second thing to remember is that the Commission makes a proposal, but it's ultimately the Council which takes the decision. And they take a number of decisions based on, how hard it's going to hit their fishing sector. So if there's a proposal for a reduction of 50 or 60 or 70%, that needs to be mitigated, because it could essentially close a specific fishery. It could mean that certain fishermen can't even leave port because they don't have enough quota to go out and fish. So those are all factors which influence how the Council of Ministers takes its decision on tax and quotas. I think, though, this year we do have, just to give you some of the statistics, for 2020, of the 78 total allowable catches, or as we call them, 53 total allowable catches, which are decided by the EU alone. 47 of those were set at levels corresponding with maximum sustainable yield, or sustainably. So we often tend to fixate on the number of quotas. I prefer to look at the number of landings, because that's much more, I translate in the how much of the fish that we're catching is actually being fished sustainably. And I go back to the figure of the 99.4% of all the fish that is landed by tax that we set, so that the European Union sets, are being fished sustainably. And I think that's a very important figure to remember.
Okay, just to remind everyone that you can use the hashtag OurFishRadio to send in your questions on Twitter. We have some questions already. But before we go to them, I just want to move the conversation slightly on to the EU's new Green Deal, the flagship policy of the von der Leyen Commission. How do fisheries fit into this from your perspective?
So, as we were saying, fish are a big part of the ocean, and the ocean is a big part of how the planet deals with climate change. If the von der Leyen Commission is really committed to delivering a new Green Deal that's actually going to address the climate emergency and the nature emergency that we're facing, then the ocean needs to be at the centre of that. And as we were discussing, we have a common fisheries policy. We also have a marine strategy framework directive, which is more around the marine ecosystem level management. But we still have big problems with the implementation of those things. And without a healthy ocean, we can't fight the climate crisis. We need a healthy ocean to fight the climate crisis. So we need the ocean to be at the centre of the new Green Deal. We need to have it prioritising action to end overfishing, transition to more sustainable forms of fishing. As Elisa said, there is in the policy already ways that we should be prioritising less destructive forms of fishing, but it hasn't happened. We should be giving more quota to less destructive forms of fishing that both don't disrupt the seabed, which is really important as a carbon sink. So, there are many interactions happening in the ocean that affects its way of mitigating climate change, and also how to adapt to climate change. And there are many things that we can do to improve that. So we need to ensure that, prioritising these other and very achievable and direct actions to improve the health of the ocean, that these need to be prioritised and delivered, so that we have the ecosystem in as good a health as it can be. Because fishing is one impact, but it is quite directly manageable.
So from the perspective of the Green Deal, though, what specifically, how should fisheries fit in there, sort of structurally within the vision?
It should be perceived as one impact
do you
part
not think that the plans for the new Green Deal have done that yet?
No, the new Green Deal thus far has not really represented the incredible value and importance of a healthy ocean ecosystem to mitigating and adapting to climate change. It hasn't done that. The Commission proposal hasn't. The European Parliament's comments or proposed resolutions. Sorry, I never know exactly how to frame that. Their resolution do address it to a degree, but there really should be a whole section on how we improve the health of the ocean. This includes directly ending overfishing immediately transitioning to more sustainable fishing gears that are less impacting, reducing emissions from the fishing fleet. You know, we have overcapacity in the European fishing fleet. Apparently, the global fishing fleet produces 1% of CO2 emissions. It's quite a lot, considering that the fishing fleet isn't necessarily that massive. But, you know, around 60% of that on a global level is too much. We've got way too many boats in the water at the moment, considering how many fish are still left in the ocean. And in Europe, we have, you know, not necessarily as extreme a situation, but certainly we have overcapacity, and certainly we could reduce CO2 emissions from the fishing fleet. And by putting more fish into the system, then you're actually also increasing the capacity of the ocean to absorb more CO2. So these kinds of things need to be in the Green Deal and in any climate action plans that are really looking at all the areas where we can mitigate and adapt to climate change.
Elisa, so the accusation is that the new Green Deal is not focused enough on the oceans as a way of fighting climate change. You presumably disagree, or do you think?
Well,
do you think that it doesn't need to be so far into the Green Deal, and that DG Mare is already?
Well, I think first of all, what the Green Deal aims to do is for Europe to become a climate neutral or a climate neutral continent by 2050. So that's the objective. Everything what we do when it comes to food production, when it comes to renewable energy, when it comes to fisheries, when it comes to agriculture, our protection of biodiversity, whether it's marine or land, revolves around ensuring that we aim to achieve this objective. So I think the Green Deal is a first step. I don't think. And I don't think at all that our Commission President or Vice President Timmermans has any is limited to just the Green Deal. It's just there's a series of things that are going to be happening as part of the Green Deal, which we now need to be watching out for. We're working very closely in the Commission now to ensure that the new EU's biodiversity strategy comes out at the end of March, together with the farm to fork strategy. So we really are looking at a number of initiatives increasing offshore renewable energy by 35%. We're looking at re-examining the targets and the ambition that we have when it comes to marine biodiversity. So those are another things that we're looking at. We're looking at ways of in which internationally we can make a number of commitments later on this year in China. But all of this, and this is very important, all of these commitments that we're looking to make and that we are, as part of the Green Deal and as part of the biodiversity strategy and as part of the farm to fork, we need to remember that the common fisheries policy is and will remain about both environmental and socioeconomic sustainability. We currently are importing 2/3 of our seafood. So it's very good that we have these sustainable fishing practices and fishing objectives in our common fisheries policy, and that we ensure that our fisheries management is aimed towards those objectives. But we also need to be very careful not to export our environmental footprint to third countries. Because if we start to say things like, well, we're going to close this fishery, or we're going to ban this fishing technique, we're simply going to be transposing the problem elsewhere. And consumers will be buying that fish from unsustainable fishing practices, not from an EU member state, but from a third country which has even lower standards of environmental and socioeconomic sustainability. So we need to strike the right balance between saying, yes, let's be ambitious, but let's also be realistic, and let's be careful that we don't, export, unsustainable practices.
So you're saying ambitious and realistic commitments that you want to make, but as we've heard, the commitments that have already been made have not been upheld. So why should citizens trust that any commitments made under the new Green Deal regarding fisheries will be upheld and will be possible to be met?
The Common Fisheries Policy predates the Green Deal. The Green Deal is not just about fisheries. Let's make it clear.
No, of course
that
not, but-
it's about the whole continent. It's about making sure that we're climate neutral. It's about ensuring that when it comes to everything from the energy that we use to the food that we eat, that we're practicing what we preach in terms of sustainability. So it's operationalizing that sustainability. The Common Fisheries Policy is already aimed at achieving those objectives of sustainability. But as Rebecca pointed out, and I've also alluded to, we still have some ways to go. So we need to step up our efforts to make sure that we work towards more sustainable fishing practices, that we work together with third countries as well in a global context, whether it's through regional fisheries management organizations or the recently agreed agreement on, we would call it the BBNJ, so on biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So, we have a number of challenges ahead, and we still need to continue. So I don't think that people should be disappointed. In fact, I think people should see that fisheries today is in a much better state than it was 10, 15, or even 20 years ago. If you look at the reports or at the discussion or at the debates going on in the early 1990s, they bear absolutely no relevance to the debates that we're having today about fisheries. So we need to make sure that we relativize our discussion. That is not to say that we shouldn't put the pressure on to ensure that we still go for these objectives.
So I've had a question from the
Yes.
room. So the question is, what are we doing to move beyond maximum sustainable yields in fishing?
I think we tend to be fixated on maximum sustainable yield, but when you talk to scientists, I mean, it's always, it's a bit of a relative concept. I think fisheries management and sustainable fisheries, it's not just about maximum sustainable yield. For me, beyond MSY, as they call it, is about ensuring that we have selective fishing practices, so full implementation of the landing obligation, which is something that we tend to forget when we're so focused on tax and quotas and focused on MSY. We need to make sure that small-scale fisheries is also involved, that we have a sustainable future for small-scale fisheries, which is also a problem. We need to make sure that we revise control rules, that we enforce our control rules, that we extend remote electronic monitoring systems to cover also the small-scale fishing fleet. We need to make sure that we have things like CCTV cameras where we know that this could potentially be an issue, so to ensure that control and enforcement. So I think for me, the beyond MSY discussion, what can we do over and beyond MSY, is to make sure that we have a fisheries management system which also takes into account the complexities of mixed fisheries, the ecosystem-based approach, so the relationship between the fish that we catch, the fish that they prey on, the predators, the seabed, the noise, the whole package. That, for me, is beyond MSY.
How do you feel about MSY?
I mean, it's
And
quite
beyond.
fascinating that I could just say I actually agree with Elisa, which I do on many of those things and on all of those things. But the thing which I think we have where we have a slight disconnect at the moment is this view that if we set the fishing limits for the biggest or most important fish stocks at the right level, because we have what's termed a mixed fishery, so that means that people go fishing with their trawl nets and they collect more than just one species of fish. They're actually collecting many different types of marine life and fish, and the objective, as Elisa said, is to have ecosystem-based management. I mean, that's where we should be going. That's where this discussion on fisheries and managing the oceans went 20 years ago. And we're still been dragging our heels to get to this position now. And how that relates with MSY is where we have a problem right now, because the most important fish stocks are being set at MSY, and the ones that are smaller, have smaller volumes, are still in the ecosystem and important. Their fishing limits are not being set at that maximum level. So an ecosystem-based approach would be that you manage your ecosystem to the more vulnerable or the more in some cases, they're actually valuable in the food web, but they may be just smaller in volume. So you manage your system to that, which means that instead of saying, well, we'll set cod at 20,000 tonnes, which is in line with MSY or the scientific advice, but we'll ignore the fact that these other 5 species, we'll have to overfish them so that we can catch this much cod, because cod's the most important for us. This is just an example, it's not real. But that is how we are doing it at the moment. What we should be doing is managing it for the ecosystem, for the more vulnerable species, making sure that their limits are sustainable. And yes, it will require that some fish, you won't take as many. You'll have to catch less of them. But ultimately, in the medium term, when the populations all rebuild and the system becomes healthier, then you can catch more fish again. It's kind of this problem that we have that, as Elisa said before, it's true, the council sets the quotas. The commission proposes them though, but the council sets them. And you have these decisions being made by fisheries ministers, and their biggest influencer is the fishing industry. They're in charge of regulating that industry, but they're also somehow in charge of supporting the industry, or that's how they communicate it. But the problem is that actually fish, as we've discussed, are much more important than just fish to be caught and fish to be eaten. They're actually really critical to the whole ecosystem and to ocean health. So instead of having this decision-making process where it's dominated by short-term politics, these guys who are influenced very heavily for the next 1 or 2 years, we should be having decisions that are made to rebuild the health of the ecosystem that may only take 5 years. And maybe in some cases, the rebuild is very, very rapid, but nobody's willing to take that, to make those hard decisions. They're just using, short-term political decision-making. And so we're never getting there. We're like, we're on this treadmill just going in the same, we're going very slightly forward towards the front of the treadmill maybe, but we're still kind of stuck. We're stuck in this position, and we're not going to get beyond MSY. We're not going to get, even enforced fisheries rules. As Elisa mentioned, the landing obligation, we're meant to be transitioning to more selective gear. We're meant to be stopping the waste of fish at sea, but nobody wants to implement it. Nobody wants to, the government does not want to enforce those rules in the different member states. So you have these big commitments made to the public on one hand, these big ambitions about we're going to address nature and biodiversity and climate crisis, and then you have these very short-term daily decision-makings, and they're not contiguous.
Okay, we've got some questions from our Twitter, from the hashtag relative to this. I'll start working through some of the questions. We've got Vera Coelho, who I think is in the room. Yeah, hello. So one of the questions posted here is, I think relevant to this. So doesn't the common fisheries policy require to end overfishing for all stocks precisely because they're important to the ecosystem, rather than just the biggest stocks, the ones delivering 99% of landings? She follows up by saying, by the way, 99% of landings is not the same as 99% of catches or mortality, Elisa. Mm-hmm. So the question is, doesn't the CFP require to end overfishing for all stocks rather than just the biggest stocks?
The CFP requires that all stocks are fished sustainably. And again, I want to make sure that we remember that the system of TAC and quotas, so I talked about the landings and the catches and the number of TACs and everything, is limited to the Northeast Atlantic. We often seem to forget that we also have the Mediterranean and the Black Seas, where the situation is actually much more critical than in the Northeast Atlantic. There, what we have is a number of plans in place. So we have, for example, I mentioned before, the Western Mediterranean plan, where over the next couple of years we're going to be reducing fishing effort by a whopping 40%. So that's almost half of all fishing effort will be reduced over the next few years to really to push for more recovery of the stocks there. So already this year we have a first reduction of 10%. Then we have measures that we've agreed also with our third country partners in the Mediterranean. So for example, for demersal fisheries in the Adriatic, we're going to be reducing that by 12%. We're going to be reducing pelagic fisheries by 5% this year and 5% next year. We have an eel closure, so a 3-month closure for eels all in every single sea basin. So Mediterranean, Black Sea, well, there's not really, mostly Mediterranean, Baltic, and the Northeast Atlantic. So we need to not fixate simply on the TAC and quota system. It's, of course, the easiest one to focus on because these are the visible quota setting mechanisms that we have in the Council of Ministers in October and in December. But we have a lot of other things going on which are contributing to that goal to ensure that we achieve MSY or sustainability in all our stocks. And I agree with the point being made by Rebecca. We have a tendency to focus on the big stocks, the emblematic stocks. We talk about cod, or we talk about bluefin tuna, and we don't tend to look at other species. But for example, sprat, which is about as unsexy as you can get as terms of a fish sort, sprat has had a miraculous recovery in the Baltic, in part, believe it or not, because of the bad situation of cod. So what you're seeing is, and it's not an ideal situation in fisheries management, because when stocks go down, other stocks also go up. You know, fisheries is not an exact science, and one of the challenges of fisheries management isn't just dealing with the decisions of Council of Ministers, but is dealing with the unpredictability of a situation and advice that goes here one year, there the other year, or here one year, there the other year. And whatever you do as a fisheries manager, if you raise the quota or you raise the fishing effort, you get criticized. If you bring it down, you get criticized. So it's a very delicate balancing act to take what is fisheries science, which is not an exact science, where we don't have sufficient data, and make the right decisions. So yeah.
Well, I was just going to
Yeah.
say, but isn't it true that, I mean, for a number of stocks we've seen these fishing limit proposals that go high one year and then low the next. But for a number of fish stocks that we've been watching, actually this is also a result of fishing too hard, too fast. So for example, the Baltic Sea Cod that you mentioned earlier, there were suggestions of the cod stock recovering, and as soon as the scientists wrote that into an advice, even though they said this stock is still very overfished, it's still only had 1 year of good recruitment, they call it, so they've had a good breeding year. They said we should be very careful not to set the fishing limit too high because it's very vulnerable. Ignored that. Fishing managers ignored that. Still set the fishing limit above the scientific advice, or at the maximum, absolute maximum, or above the maximum. And oh voila, what a surprise. The next year, they have to cut the quota. I mean, yes, it's complicated. Yes, it's not exact and precise, but it's also not rocket science. If you would take a precautious approach and if you treat it as an upper limit, then you give the fish population, the fish stocks, the environment some capacity to breathe instead of constantly being pushed to the limit, where of course, you know, you don't have to go very far to fall over the edge, and we have this kind of boom bust cycle. I mean, this is the point, is that by using MSY as a limit, by treating the system as a system that is interdependent, you take out that kind of, you release that pressure and you make it more resilient, you make it more robust, and then there would be less fluctuation in the system. You wouldn't have the impacts on the fishing industry that we've had.
We've got some questions on this. Let's keep going on the people that, because some people have been tweeting in about this. So Johnny Hughes has tweeted to say that Celtic Sea Cod is at its lowest level ever. This is towards you, I fear,
Yep.
Elisa. Why did you set the quota above the scientific advice every single year, causing it to collapse? What did you think was going to happen? He also says that about your comment saying CFP means all stocks should be fished sustainably. So why have Irish sea whiting, Irish sea cod, west of Scotland cod, and west of Scotland whiting being overfished every single year since 1981? So he's saying that basically these specific stock quotas and limits are not being applied in the right way.
Okay, I'm not an expert on individual fish stocks, so I'm going to give a quite general answer. What I do know from the situation from the last Fishing Opportunities Council or Attack and Quota Council is, and I fully agree with Johnny, it's the cod in the Celtic Sea is one of the more sensitive stocks and one of the most depleted stocks there. What we have set, and I want to go back to the point I made before, is that decisions in fisheries management also have to be taken in the context of mixed fisheries. So fishermen will be aiming to fish for one particular stock, but accidentally catching other stocks. So we call that bycatch. And Celtic Sea Cod is one of those bycatches. We have had to set a limit for the bycatch. What we've tried to do in this year's Fisheries Council is to apply remedial measures. So we have applied a number of restrictions in terms of the gear, the mesh size that fishermen are allowed to use to ensure that we try to avoid catching this particular stock accidentally. So we have imposed this now on the fishermen. We have also imposed these changes in the mesh sizes in specific areas where we know that the cod tends to be caught. And with that, we have also written to member states to ask them to take more longer-term remedial measures to deal in particular with this situation of cod in the Celtic Sea.
Okay, so next question. I'll move on. I think that So this is actually an interesting one for you. I think there's a Twitter handle called EU Political Report. Name yourself. Who says Michel Barnier is demanding open access for EU fishing fleets to British waters in the interest of taking control of determined action to protect fish stocks. It is something that's gonna matter for fisheries, though, right? For fish stocks, for environmental reasons, should the UK resist this? Do you think the UK should resist allowing EU fleets into British waters?
Well, look, I think there is basically no way that I can say how the EU and the UK should manage their trade relationship in shared waters. I mean, essentially, this is actually a classic example, though, of what happens with fish, is that fish are treated not as a critical part of an important ecosystem that we all depend on, but a trading card. It's a trading card. I mean, this is essentially how they are being dealt with.
And this is going to be a huge issue through the coming years of how, the world you work in is perceived and the discussions around it, though.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, basically, the UK was, of course, part of the EU when we defined our fisheries management system, and the UK has previously been a very strong advocate for sustainable fisheries management also. So they were, part of the EU group that committed to ending overfishing by 2020, that committed to a landing obligation to stop discarding at sea. They have, been introducing cameras on fishing vessels to ensure that people, catch data is accurate and that people are following the rules. They actually have a reasonable reputation on fisheries management, or at the same level as the rest of the EU. So I think what is going to be most important is that both the EU and the UK, in how they manage this trade relationship, maintain that the bottom line is that they will not overfish. They will not just do their own thing. They have to. It's like when you get divorced. Yeah, you still got a child that you have to you have to co-parent. You have to have a responsible relationship, because otherwise you're going to destroy your child. Yeah. Okay, maybe this happens a lot in real life. Maybe it's not a good.
But it's not the ideal.
Maybe it's not a good example.
It's
but
not
it's
the
not
ideal
the
result.
situation.
No, yeah.
But this is the same thing with these waters. Is that, you know, the EU and the UK have to have a relationship. The fact is that the UK exports a lot of fish to EU countries, and EU vessels have always accessed UK waters. Also, because the UK gives them quota. I mean, there's a little bit of misinformation, I think, amongst many people in the UK, that actually through the system that the EU and through the EU Common Fisheries Policy, UK gets a whole lot of quota already, or before it left, that it immediately gave to international, foreign, Dutch, other companies that didn't go anywhere near its own fleet. So it chose to do that when it was part of the EU. So, you know, it's a bit more complicated. I mean, Elisa might have another perspective. But
Let's pick it up. We're running out of time, so we can go on for a little bit longer, can we?
I believe so.
Are you happy? Yeah. Okay. So we'll just go on a couple more minutes. Let's continue. I know you're not going to want to comment on Michel Barnier's trade negotiations and upcoming things, but how do you see this? Is a potential negotiation with the UK over its waters going to distract from the necessary changes and focus on the climate issues surrounding fisheries?
I don't think it necessarily has to. And we have 100 shared stocks, more than 100 shared stocks with the UK. So, you know, it's going to be complicated to find an arrangement which suits all of us. At the moment, we have the transition rules. So for the moment, nothing really changes much. And over the next few months, Michel Barnier and his team will have to find an agreement which suits both parties. We have a precedent, which is Norway, where we have yearly agreements on shared tax. Sometimes that works well, sometimes that works less well, but it's a system which has been going for several years. So I think from our side, there's lots of optimism that an agreement can be found, and there's certainly willingness to find that agreement.
Okay, there is a question here on the YouTube feed from Sasongi B. It says, nowadays the fish contains more and more mercury and other kind of heavy metals. Is there any new regulation in the Green Deal to control water pollution?
For the moment, no. But as I mentioned before, we have the upcoming biodiversity strategy, where we will be looking at things like protection of marine protected areas and improving on the network that we have now, being more ambitious in terms of having effective management plans. We also will have the farm to fork strategy, in which we will be looking at sustainable food production systems, which is not just sustainability from an environmental perspective, but is also about safety and security of the food supply. So watch this space.
Do you think that water pollution should be in the Green Deal regarding mercury, metals and fish?
I honestly don't know, because I don't look at water pollution issues directly. Okay. Because water pollution issues are generally coming from land-based sources, usually.
Interesting.
So
of course.
it's managed it should be controlled and managed by a different system of legislation and regulation.
Okay, so we are running out of time. Thanks to everyone for their questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions. I wonder if you just want to make any final comments before we wrap up this morning.
No, I think that it's clear, and I said this at the beginning, you know, the IPCC report, the fact that we have this Green Deal on the table, the fact that President von der Leyen and also the European Parliament have made this a priority for the next 5 years, means that we do, and I fully agree with what Rebecca has been arguing here, we need to step up our efforts in order to ensure that we have a sustainable future for both fisheries and the fishery sector, and that we ensure that we have a better protection of the marine environment. So I hope we can all be working together for that.
And final comments from you, Rebecca?
Yeah, I think that definitely we just would like to see that the role of fish is broader than just the fishing industry, and that healthy oceans are at the centre of the Green Deal and climate action plans, and that means that we can end overfishing and make it very, very specific, very immediate impact.
Thank you so much. Thank you for openly discussing. It's been a really, really enjoyable and vibrant discussion. Thanks for everyone in the room, and thanks for everybody watching online. Have a great rest of your day.